Today, I'm going to cover everything that's going to happen in the September 25th episode of Beyond the Gates. Two shocks rock Fairmont Crest, Jacob shows up with a game-changing announcement, and Anita and Vernon have to go into damage control to save the family name. If you're interested in the Danny Andre, Vanessa Joey Branches, or whether June will be the surprise hero, this clip is all you need before the show airs. Hit like and subscribe, because we're about to tease out the spoilers from reputable sources and predict the final twist. Fairmont Crest never truly sleeps, and the air is as heavy as velvet soaked in water, weighed down with secrets and vows that were never quite spoken. Anita woke very early, as she always did when she sensed an invisible crack running the length of the family she had spent half a lifetime patching. The feeling was no longer vague. It had a shape, a rhythm, the sound of a heart knocking stubbornly against a frame in the dark. Vernon stood on the balcony, his hands gripping the railing until the knuckles blanched. Not from the cold, but from an anger that had been locked up too long. In recent weeks, Leslie, just a name that once seemed harmless, had sent the Dupree order spinning into a vortex, and he knew that if they did not stop it, everything behind the gates would sift away like sand. Anita did not ask, Vernon did not speak. The two of them understood a single truth. Peace in this family had never been a gift of fate. It had always been the result of cold, sometimes merciless decisions, carved by people brave enough to accept carrying the sentence of their own moral compromise. The question now was how far they would have to go and what ledger the final price would be subtracted from. Leslie moved through the house like a whisper turned too loud. She did not scream, accuse, or seethe. She asked questions. She requested files. She scoured appointment logs, found irregular gaps, ran fingerprints on old photographs, cross-checked the inconsistencies in the stories of older generations. Every motion was quiet and sharp as a razor, and as with any young person who peers too deeply into the fogged mirror of the past, she touched Barbara. That name streaked across a white wall like a smear of red paint, impossible to scrub out, only ever covered by fresh coats. Barbara, according to the fragments revealed so far, was Leslie's mother and the keystone in a long chain of concealments spanning many people and many years. Anita knew, Vernon knew, the elders knew, but each held only a piece. Each guarded a slice of the picture, and everyone believed their slice alone was enough to obscure the rest. The mistake lay precisely there. When Leslie decided to investigate Barbara's death, the final thin coat of paint was scratched up, and the damp smell of unsaid things rose and seeped across Fairmont Crest. Anita realized that if she let Leslie continue, what would collapse was not a simple genealogy tale. It was the power base she and Vernon had built to protect everyone else. Her anger did not burst on the surface. It seeped like acid, drop by drop, from the inside, corroding and driving her at once. She was angry at Leslie for believing that truth here obeyed the rules of books, that things once placed in sunlight would dry, come clean, and feel lighter. She was angry at herself for allowing the hairline fractures of time to become passageways for a girl with a will like Leslie's. And she was angry at Vernon, because his calm looked too much like hesitation, and his caution too easily resembled a species of weakness painted over with vague advice about consequences. Vernon was not weak. He knew how easily the line between protection and control could be confused when old fear returned. He had already lost too much, and he understood that a clan endures not because its leaders are always right, but because they know when it is the right time to do the wrong thing. This time felt different, because every option on the table smelled metallic, carried the chill of the morgue. Anita voiced two words he had avoided: take care. She did not incite, did not sketch a plan. She spoke of it like the last entry in a family crisis manual, a page rarely turned but never absent. If a mouth insisted on speaking, if a hand kept pulling, if a truth could not be managed by apology, money, or authority, what remained but to silence it forever? Vernon listened and fell into a long silence. It was not assent nor refusal. It was the space where a person stands at the edge of a precipice and wonders how the wind will feel on the rock face when he falls. He did not relish such measures, yet he knew that sometimes great houses are built on things never discussed at dinner. He remembered the ones who had vanished from the collective tale, the names no longer mentioned, the faces cut from photographs. No one asked where they had gone, because the answer was always present in the elder's eyes. Jacob returned from a night torn into shreds, his gaze a storm warning hanging from the eaves. In his hand, he held a piece of information others might call destiny. To him, it was a double-edged knife he was obliged to lay on the table of someone he did not wish to hurt. Fairmont Crest would face 2 revelations in one day, and he was the bearer of at least one. He was not arrogant for thinking himself thunder. He simply knew that the words he would release could ignite the gas cans lined up around here. He agonized over whom to tell first because the wrong person would kill the wrong person, and the wrong moment would kill the right chance. Derek's name drifted through his head like a string of unsolved code, a man holding a secret whose very silence made sound. Jacob had reason to believe Derek knew something which, placed next to Barbara's story, made a bridge across a chasm. But there was also Doug, a shadow rippling across the surface of rumor and cutting through calls that ended abruptly. If what Jacob held proved to be news of Doug's death, a possibility nobody wanted to name but everyone entertained, then today's puzzle would not merely break. It would splinter and pierce even those standing farthest away. While the elders adjusted the war map of their internal conflict, Bill and Haley slipped into a private low-pressure system where memory and loyalty clashed, whipping up small twisters strong enough to pry shingles from the roof they had just built. Danny's unexpected wedding was the final nail in a door that Bill had thought closed. He tried to tell himself it was only impulse, an ink blot that would dry, that everyone sometimes wanted to flee the cage they had so carefully furnished. Yet every time he closed his eyes he saw Danny, not as she was now, but as the woman whose hand he had once held. Haley noticed the slightest flinch, the silent fractures, the gaze that shifted its angle. She reminded herself that every marriage has dim corners and old shadows, that an old name resurfacing does not automatically mean a heart has moved on. But she also knew there are storms that do not dissipate just because people stand still. Her calm became a discipline that punished, because beneath it lay a sheet of ice cracking whenever someone mentioned Danny or the congratulatory notes pouring in for Danny and Andre. Bill fought a trial where he served as judge and defendant at once. He hated himself for wanting to flee when he saw wedding photos, for answering one of Haley's texts too slowly, for a mind stubbornly tugging him back to afternoons when sunlight fell on someone else's shoulders. Haley hated herself for memorizing the contours of Danny's face from old pictures, for comparing herself unfairly in the mirror, for even considering asking the sort of question that, once spoken, cannot be retrieved. Anita summoned trusted advisors, not to listen but to check whether the final screws of a contingency plan were tightened. She did not presume to walk to the worst end, but she refused to be surprised by anyone else's naivete. She reviewed the list of people who might hold too much about Barbara. Documents, quiet transfers, a car never found, a rainy night, a faint path. She studied the names like a physician reading scans, noting the dark spots that must be excised before they spread. Vernon watched her command the crisis like a fire drill captain, missing no exit, testing every extinguisher. He remembered her younger, when her anger burned like fireworks, brilliant and brief. Now it smoldered like embers in a stove, never truly out, always hot enough to warn that bare hands should not touch. He was tired of being the one to beg a halt at the edge. Tired because he knew his arguments looked like fear. Tired because part of him understood that unless they pushed back hard, Leslie would not falter. That fatigue made him snap at small things. The imperfect click of a closing door, the evasive eyes of a house servant, the blinking notification of Jacob's message. He was not ready to read at last. Jacob knocked. He came without preface or staging. He went straight for the core because he knew any circumlocution would create opportunities for error. The first news he delivered struck Anita and Vernon like hail after a sweltering day. Fresh evidence about Barbara, not the kind that could be buried under rerouted narratives, but the sort that could trace a path, assign names, fix time, and pull responsibility along behind it. The second news remained unsaid, but it stood at Jacob's back like a lengthening shadow as the sun tilted. He observed the two of them as one who had just lit a lamp in a room that no one had dared open for years, watching dust drift in bright bands while the forgotten shapes took their true form. Anita tightened her wrist, not from fear but from counting through options the way a chess player reads 7 moves ahead. Vernon looked to the window, to a garden as green as if nothing flat was about to collapse, and thought that before the roots were ripped from the soil, he had to decide whether to save the tree or bury its traces. The news about Barbara set Leslie ablaze. She was no longer a petitioner for data. She appointed herself the one who set the pace. She assembled fragments, cross-checked timestamps, saw the seams where stories failed to align, like a puzzle solver who knows 2 pieces belong together by intuition and habit. She failed to notice how quickly she moved in front of people who had spent whole lives learning that everything here has a cost. For her, the price of truth was a little anger, a few tears, some relationships that would crack and mend. For Anita, the price of truth was sometimes a life erased from the minutes. For Vernon, the price of truth was the future of innocent children thrown into tales they had never asked to be born into. And while all 3 looked down the same road, each saw a different map. Bill met Haley on an afternoon not sunny enough to warm and not cloudy enough to rain. He had 1,000 things to say and none that could soften the freshly opened distances. He longed to shield Haley from the comparisons he himself was trapped in, to preserve their marriage from the name Danny, now back like an unwanted prompt. Yet the impulse to protect can look like the impulse to conceal, and Haley despised the feeling of being blindfolded in her own home. She wanted no theatrics. She wanted truth, even if truth required her to stand alone for a time. She knew love is a series of decisions repeated daily, not a signature or ceremony, and she was no longer sure Bill had repeated that decision for her over the last few days. Her anger did not explode. It rose like tidewater, drowning the easy laughter. The near future forked into 2 roads: patience with hope or pride with solitude. Both had thorns. Both drew blood. What she lacked was certainty that the person walking beside her would not spend too long looking back. Danny, elsewhere, was calm in the manner of someone who had done something reckless and decided not to begrudge the scratches. Andre stood beside her as an unerasable fact, a clear choice after a long blur. But clarity itself was the fresh gust that shifted and intensified the storm over Fairmont Crest. The cord between Danny and Bill had never been only a string of memories. It was a habit of mind, a reflex of heart. Bill understood that better than anyone, and he also knew habits and reflexes only change through a repeated sequence of new choices, many times for long enough. He was unsure whether he was strong enough to do that, and his hesitation exhausted Haley. The danger was that fatigue makes the simplest choice, throwing things away, the most tempting, while the hardest choice, staying and repairing, demands more than pride enjoys giving. When Bill's gaze drifted toward Danny, he opened a door that Haley now had to either slam with force or walk out of and never return. Behind a closed door, Anita and Vernon touched the darkest option as people test the edge of a blade. They assessed the names that might need to be neutralized if Leslie stepped too near the truth about Barbara. They considered an accident, a stumble, a faraway trip with no return. Every consider meant that somewhere, someone would lose a part of themselves so that the rest could endure. Vernon felt himself becoming the man he had sworn not to reprise, one who spoke violence as the dialect of power. Anita felt herself reverting to the girl who had learned not to tremble when closing a door behind which someone cried. Both recognized their boundaries were moving, and that very recognition made them angry. Angry at Leslie for dragging them here, angry at Barbara for leaving a riddle that no one could solve without dirtying their hands, angry at Fairmont Crest for being so beautiful that everyone believed evil would tire and fade. They were angry at each other, because each one's glance was a mirror exposing the other's shadow. After dropping the first weight of news, Jacob faced the second. Rumor about Doug was already hot enough to self-ignite, but he held not rumor but a shard of confirmation as painful as bone. If he spoke now, Fairmont Crest would tremble hard enough to shatter every other plan. If he withheld, he would betray the single function that allowed him to meet his own eyes. He thought again of Derek, the odd traces in behavior, the calls missed at perfect moments, a string of coincidences that stopped being coincidental when arranged side by side. Perhaps Derek had not struck the match, but he knew the path of the flame, and he knew who would be burned. Jacob was wedged between two banks, saying what is right or keeping what is least wrong. He chose the option that would earn him hatred from both sides. He warned the few who needed to know just enough to prepare without divulging everything, granting them a breath before the hammer fell. The decision did not save him from the guilt of curation, but it bought him a night of sleep with fewer nightmares. Meanwhile, Leslie drew closer to Barbara. She followed an old voucher, found a person who had once worked at an outlying clinic where Barbara's name surfaced with a frequency that made one wonder why a single woman appeared in so many places across the same span of time. She unfolded a form and detected a mismatched signature, a letter written backward in one version and properly in another. She chased that letter like a thread out of a maze. She believed that by answering Barbara she would answer herself. What she did not understand was that sometimes the answer to one's own origin does not free. It binds tighter, forcing a person to carry a legacy without flowers or music. With each step forward, Anita receded deeper into the penumbra of her plan, into calls never saved, faces without names, unpaved roads without cameras. Bill stood before the mirror and, for the first time in years, admitted something simple. He was weak before memory. He had once imagined that adulthood meant learning to forget. It turns out adulthood is learning to carry without letting it choke the present. He looked at Haley rearranging books on a shelf, each volume a small life waiting to be opened. He understood that if he wanted to stay, he would have to reread from the beginning the book they were writing together, not keep moving it to another page and pretend it was finished. Wanting is one thing, doing another. He made calls, set appointments, arranged a sequence of concrete acts to pull his heart out of its old orbit. Each small act dulled the point of Haley's anger but did not yet warm it. She waited to see whether he would repeat them tomorrow, next week, or whether this was merely an impulse to douse flames. Like the promises of other men she had known, Fairmont Crest braced for two blasts. The first bore the name Barbara, a force that would shatter frames, topple statues, and expose cracks whose provenance lay in some distant night. The second might be named Doug or something else, but it would collapse the makeshift bridges between households, turning neighbors into watchmen of one another. Anita and Vernon clasped hands like swimmers in a riptide, knowing that if they let go now, they would be dragged in two directions. They were no longer debating right and wrong. They were debating remaining or losing. Leslie stood on the other bank of the same current, convinced that flinging truths into the water was the only way to clear it. Jacob stood on the shore, trying to channel the flow with sandbags of information, aware that if he did not balance them well, he would be swept away himself. Night fell, bringing with it 1,000 small decisions awaiting signatures from hands trembling lightly with fatigue. Anita opened a hidden drawer and withdrew a yellowed envelope. Vernon regarded it like a guillotine suspended by a thread. They weighed it one last time. If they signed, a name would leave the play. If they burned it, the night might be quiet, but dawn would bring a knock at the door. At the same moment, Leslie received a new tip from an unnamed source, enough to turn her search into a race. Time gone, she plunged where she believed the truth led. Bill sat beside Haley on the sofa, the space between them the width of an unspoken decision. He knew that if he chose Danny, he might appear honest with himself, yet he would discard the thing he always insisted mattered most: a future not puppet by the past. If he chose Haley, he would have to face the name Danny every day like a test without end, and only repeated actions could grade it in his stead. Just before dawn, Jacob sent 2 messages. The first went to Anita and Vernon. A time, a place, a recommendation on how to mitigate damage when the barber information slipped beyond anyone's control. The second reached a small circle, including those close to Doug, a reminder to brace themselves. He wondered if he had saved someone from shock or merely prolonged pain. Anita read and slid the envelope back into the drawer. Vernon exhaled, not in relief, but like a man deprived of the right to self-destruct after tidying his desk. They would not sign tonight, not because they had suddenly become believers in redemption, but because they had relearned an old lesson. The most terrifying thing is not truth itself, but truth announced at a moment when one is unprepared. They would be ready. They would reset the table, adjust the lights, arrange the guests, and when the blast came, they would stand exactly where they meant to stand. Leslie arrived at a desolate spot to which a small fact about Barbara had led her. She saw a smear of paint, the impression of an old tire, a tiny object someone had forgotten beneath a shrub. The pieces snapped into place. She did not know that at a careful distance a pair of eyes was watching, not to harm her now, but to measure how far she had come. She did not feel fear, not because she was braver than others, but because she believed that once in the very center of a labyrinth, fear is useless. She would keep moving even if every step sounded like the crunch of a dry twig underfoot. Inside the house, Bill chose to stay seated. Not once and for all, but like a person setting a schedule. He slid the old photographs into a separate drawer, erased nothing, just placed them where they were harder to reach. Together, he and Haley marked a blank day on the calendar, not to run away, but to resume the small rituals that define a shared life. Neither offered promises, because both had learned that promises only make the echo louder when broken. They let actions speak first, and if those voices grew loud enough, words would eventually arrive. Danny, far away, was happy like a new straight line, but even straight lines cross intersections. Andre was the first. The next ones would test them both. Bill knew it, Haley knew it, and this knowledge alone helped them blame each other a little less for the gusts that would strike in the days ahead. Morning rose over Fairmont Crest, shining on shuttered windows and others about to open. Anita stepped onto the porch and, for the first time after many sleepless nights, allowed herself a single minute with eyes closed. She had not changed the plan. She had changed the tempo. She would not rush to sign heavy envelopes. She would funnel energy into preparing for the blast, rewrapping lines, dispersing risk, assigning people, adding eyes, opening ears. Vernon stood beside her, his silence now more like a brace than a blade. Leslie came home with new evidence in her pocket, heart pounding with exhilaration, unaware that on the far shore of that joy a list of names was preparing to summon her into rooms where the lights burned too bright. Jacob sat in his car, stared at the clock, and waited for events to slide into their designated grooves. He knew there would be no winners today in the usual sense. There would only be those still standing and those who had to sit and catch their breath. Somewhere among these lines, the name Doug hung suspended like a weight. If it fell, everything would plunge, and anyone who failed to pull in their legs would be crushed. Yet in that instant, as first light touched white walls and carefully trimmed hedges, everyone allowed themselves to believe there were still a few minutes left to prepare. No one said it aloud, but all felt it. And it was precisely in that fragile interval between two detonations that anger lowered its voice and hardened into a new resolve. To survive this day, no matter what must be abandoned behind, no matter which fresh sins must be shouldered, as long as when night came there was still one's own person sitting close by, still a place to return to, still a door to lock before going to sleep.